Annenberg Media.
Additional funding was provided by this and other public television stations and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
One of the most startling sights I have encountered anywhere in Africa is this approach to Yamoussoukro, the birthplace of the founder president of the Ivory Coast. All of a sudden, in the midst of the African countryside, this elaborate piece of modernity, almost out of the blue. A ghost town is usually a habitat where the people have already departed. But this particular ghost town is a place where the people haven't as yet arrived. A village turned into a city in tribute to President Houphouët-Boigny, just as America has christened its capital after its own founding father, George Washington. But this is no Washington, D.C. Yamoussoukro is an oasis of luxury in the midst of deprivation. All over Africa, development is distorted, priorities violated, and the continent has mortgaged its soul.
We're reading you loud and clear, and we're coming up on Africa now, and we're looking for some thunderstorms.
Africa is the most tropical of all continents. Yet that is precisely why tropical Africa will be the last to launch its own spacecraft. Climate was the first cause of Africa's technological slowness. Foreign invasions were the second. The third cause is independent Africa's failure to correct the distortions. This program is about how climate, colonization, and our own poor judgment have retarded Africa's economic takeoff, frustrating our own attempts at development. It all began with nature's bounty, which helped to make tropical Africa a Garden of Eden. There's a joke in East Africa about the soil being so fertile that if you dig your finger into it, your fingernail will begin to grow. But if necessity is the mother of invention, abundance is the mother of inertia. Where nature is so bountiful, why should man in equatorial Zaire need advanced innovation? Nature has been quite kind to this particular part of Africa. The society is well endowed in terms of food. A big range of animals, different plants, not just now, but across the centuries. And because nature has been so kind, nature helped to make another decision for them. They never developed into a centralized kingdom. They never developed states. People in the savannah might have developed kingdoms and states, but here their social organization was more informal, more relaxed, precisely because of the bounty of nature. Abundance on the equator reduces the need for both organization and high technology. Forest dwellers in Zaire don't need either to survive. It's all very different in the frozen regions of the world. But what have winter and snow got to do with development? Because of winter in the West, wearing clothes is not just a matter of sexual modesty. It's a matter of physical survival. Wearing shoes is not just a matter of social etiquette. It's a matter of avoiding frostbite. Now contrast this with our situation in tropical Africa. I grew up in Mombasa and I was running around barefoot. I played football barefoot. There was no such fear as frostbite. And there are societies in Africa that don't wear anything at all. They walk naked and proud. They can afford the luxury of being natural. But there has been a heavy cost in technology and in economic development. Where the winds are cold, thicker walls are erected. Engineering begins to advance. Where warmth is a matter of life and death, fire is tamed and harnessed. Where the growing season is short, survival depends on planning for winter. For the Barabeg cattle herders of Tanzania, there was no such stimulus for development. Climate had not motivated them into flights of innovation or into a culture of long-term planning. The nearer an African society was to the equator, the less it needed elaborate shelters or complicated tools. The Barabeg could live with dignity without learning to live in luxury. For hundreds of years, there has been no need for them to change their ways. But the simple life has its dangers, sometimes even its catastrophes.
Jina lako mama? Jina la bwana?
Lack of planning has cost these Kenyans dear. They have allowed their herds to multiply beyond the capacity of the land to support them. Now, a Western charity has come to the rescue to buy the emaciated animals and distribute the meat as food aid. This aid is the dependency of desperation and need in a wrecked economy. But dependency has many other faces in Africa. The well-endowed supermarket shelves of downtown Abidjan in the Ivory Coast provides one illustration. This is former French Africa. Luxuries abound for the elite, but at a price. It is a shopper's paradise, a kind of packaged Garden of Eden, with many of the items virtually forbidden fruit elsewhere in Africa. They even import drinking water from France. No wonder Idi Amin once admonished his fellow presidents, the French-speaking ones, what's wrong with our rainwater? What's wrong with our spring, with our lakes, with our rivers? Well, in reality, we know the answer. Dependency. A new abundance of imports has replaced the old abundance of nature. We have embraced colonial tastes, but at the cost of our own independence. The Ivory Coast is largely an extension of France. The economy and currency remain tied to Paris. We once gave away our gold in exchange for beads from Europe. The Ivory Coast has surrendered its wealth and autonomy in return for shimmering glass. The French colonial government has gone, but the French bureaucrats remain, and their priorities usually predominate. Western priorities are still the bugbear of independent Africa. This is Mozambique, whose people are going hungry, and yet the country continues to export sugar. This sugar mountain is not part of a fairy tale of sweet abundance. If anything, it's part of Africa's nightmare, dependency, export crops in the midst of local starvation, domestic famine. If we paid half as much attention to the storage and processing of basic foods as we do to the storage and processing of export crops, Africa's lean years would be drastically reduced. The cargo is destined for London, for the Englishman's fourth meal, afternoon tea. Alas, not everybody has sugar from a silver spoon. This tea story in Kericho is part of a much wider saga. Nothing less than the impact of Europe's sweet tooth on the history of the world and on Africa's destiny. It's an influence that extends all the way from the plantations of Jamaica to this tea hotel in Kenya. It began with sugar itself, Europe's increasing demand for sugar. So Africans were exported to the West Indies to grow it for European confectionaries and tea houses. And then, with colonialism, came dessert and beverage economies. Economies like this one of Kenya, with its emphasis on both coffee and tea, or that of Ghana, with its emphasis on cocoa for European chocolate. These were fundamentally incidental food crops. But a nagging question has arisen. Have we been producing these crops at the expense of fundamental food needs, like grain, meat, and root crops? Were we indeed so preoccupied with responding to the sweet tooth of Europe that we had forgotten our own hungry mouths? When you see a man driving in a straight line along Kampala Road, he must be drunk. Well, it's a Ugandan joke about a bad Ugandan road. but the joke is applicable to this road also in Ghana. It's the main road north-south, it's the main artery. Arguably, it's the most important road in the nation. And yet, look at it. Holes and holes and holes, sometimes miles of utter disrepair. It tells us a lot about the state of communications in Africa. It tells us a lot about the African condition. It was Julius Nyerere, the founder president of Tanzania, who once said, while the great powers are trying to get to the moon, we are trying to get to the village. Well, the great powers have been to the moon and back, and even the stars are getting closer with every improvement in space communication. But we in Africa are still trying to get to the village. If we ever do get to the village, we may never be able to get back. Communications in much of Africa are indeed a disaster. This is the second demon of post-colonial Africa, the demon of decay alongside the devil of dependency. The rust and the dust are descending upon Africa as roads crumble, telephones go silent, institutions atrophy, and rails decay. Particularly poignant to me is the decay of a place of learning, like this village school in a country once prosperous, Ghana. Some of the walls are beginning to crumble. Fewer desks every year, a leg broken here and there. And yet, that's not the worst of it. What is increasingly painful is the absence of the basic teaching materials, of paper, of pens. This school spent a whole term without those basic materials. Someone exclaimed, "Why not write to the head of state and complain?" Someone else answered, "Write? With what?" There may be more at stake here than the slow death of a school. There may be the slow death of a civilization. We may be witnessing the beginning of the end of Western culture as we have known it in Africa. In disillusion, Chrysanthus Azeriwe has taken his son out of the same village school in Ghana. There was a time when the hunger for Western-style education all over Africa was enormous. Now there is a crisis of confidence. What's the point of going to school when the school can't provide education? What's the point of being educated at all if there are no jobs at the end of it? The cash economy created wage labor, but where there are no jobs, there are no wages. The cash system is in disarray. This is another colonial institution inherited from the West, which has not taken root. Queues of desperation. These mothers in Ghana are looking to the armed forces for alternatives to decayed hospitals and shrinking medical services. There are clinics without drugs, nurses without bandages, doctors without hypodermic needles. The sickest patient of all is the health service itself. Some of the preceding political regimes had wasted and plundered a lot of foreign exchange. This latest military government is trying to make amends. But both the decaying hospitals and the fragile governments are themselves symptoms of a wider social malaise, the double sickness of things falling apart alongside failing economies dependent on outsiders. The Barabeg of Tanzania have always resisted outside influence. Relying on traditional methods, they turned their backs on the modern economy. They kept to a minimum the cultivation of land, concentrating instead on cattle as their cultural and economic heritage. But they have still not been able to escape the problems of modern Tanzania. So-called progress has collided with their herds. Canadian technology arrived in Barabeg country, trailing clouds of glory from winter, which was its home. The project was well meant, technology transfer through a kind of apprenticeship for Tanzanians. The target was wheat production, and the project succeeded in making these areas yield an impressive tonnage. The Canadians came to work as well as to lead. They were not vague idealists. They were seasoned and experienced farmers. In the short run, they did make the Hanang Plains bloom. But there has been a cost, both human and ecological. The Barabeg are at the center of this human tragedy. Much of their old pasture is now under cultivation. Ill fares the land to hastening ills a prey, where wealth accumulates and men decay. These once proud people are now scavenging for wheat droppings. Nowhere in Africa is there a sharper contrast in economic activity than here. We have the dual economy of Africa in absolutely sharp relief, bare subsistence on one side and mechanized advanced mass production on the other. The pastoralists of this side suffered. Was their martyrdom justified? Does progress require some casualties? To some extent, yes. But we could say a curse upon both their houses. The pastoralists were a little too backward-looking, too steeped in their past to survive for much longer in the coming decades. The Canadians and those who brought them brought in a kind of technological mismatch, something which wasn't fitted to this particular environment. And what is more, in the case of the Canadians, the consumption of what they produced was not basically central to Tanzanians. The Bible might have referred to people not living by bread alone. In this part of Africa, they don't live by bread at all. There is a second casualty of this prairie style of farming, the ecology. 2 years ago, this was fertile soil. Now, it's part of the lamentable story of soil erosion in Eastern Africa. It just illustrates how delicate the natural balance is in Africa. Upset one side of the balance, and you could cause irreparable damage. Remove shrubs, fell a few trees, flatten out a little hill, and the consequences could be enormous. You could also make calculations of a comparative kind. Assume that African conditions are similar to conditions elsewhere in the world. Perhaps that was one miscalculation that the Canadians made. the prairies and this part of Tanzania have one thing in common. They can both produce wheat, but the soil is different. This soil is volcanic, it is hard, and it breaks up. The soil in Canada is organic and more receptive. The patterns of the rain is different. Here, it comes down in torrents. In Canada, it's more evenly spread out. This difference has resulted in what you see. Julius Nyerere reminded his countrymen that they were custodians of the soil of their ancestors and trustees of the soil of their descendants, that they had no right to bequeath to their children soil that was less fertile than what they inherited from their forefathers. And yet, Julius Nyerere was inadvertently involved in this miscalculation. As part of that package of miscalculation, Nyerere's government also imported a sophisticated electric bakery from Canada. That was a misjudgment in favor of urban elites. By encouraging wheat, Tanzania encouraged new tastes from the winter world. Alien food habits are a prescription for further dependency upon the outside world, even if it does keep the urban masses happy. The bakery and its system of ventilation betray their origins in the winter conditions of Alberta in Canada. The spare parts are costing foreign exchange. The automation has meant far fewer jobs. Nyerere should have known better. Nyerere should have known better because one of his guiding principles for Tanzania was to discourage dependency. His policy of self-reliance